The story of the fig tree. Are you living a fig tree life? The harsh truth you need to hear. They were hungry for a harvest, but there was no fruit. And I showed them that a life without fruit is a life that is withering away. I remember the day so clearly. The sun was warm upon our shoulders as we walked from Bethany toward Jerusalem. The disciples were with me, their spirits high, their laughter filling the morning air. They were a lively bunch, full of questions and debates, eager to know all about the kingdom of God. We were all hungry, the kind of deep hunger that comes from walking long miles under the open sky. I saw a fig tree in the distance, a large and beautiful tree by the side of the road, its branches spread wide in a welcoming gesture. From a distance, it seemed to promise a bounty of sweet, ripe fruit. The tree stood alone, a magnificent spectacle of green in the dusty, barren landscape. Its branches were heavy with a canopy of broad emerald leaves, each one a testament to its vibrant health. It was a fig tree, and in that land a fig tree's leaves were a promise. The fruit of a fig tree, unlike that of other trees, appears before its leaves. So when a fig tree is in full leaf, it is a sign that it is heavy with an abundant harvest. This tree was a perfect picture of vitality and life. Its roots ran deep into the earth, drawing up water and nourishment, and its trunk was thick and sturdy, a sign of its age and strength. It had all the outward appearances of a prosperous and fruitful life. Every leaf was a declaration of its health, a silent boast to the world that it was a tree of great promise. It seemed to have everything, all the resources and all the right conditions to produce a harvest that would feed the hungry and bring joy to those who came seeking. It was a tree that had been given everything and had seemingly done everything right. It had a perfect posture, a flawless appearance, and the promise of a glorious future. It was a tree that drew the eye and sparked a hope in the hearts of all who passed by. In its very being, it declared its readiness to provide, to bless, to share. The first sign of the deeper truth came when we drew near. My disciples, their hunger sharp and their hopes high, approached the tree with a look of eager anticipation. They saw the lush leaves, the full, robust branches, and they knew what those things meant. They believed in the promise that the tree held, just as they believed in the promise of the kingdom. But as we came closer, a subtle, disquieting fact became clear. My eyes, which see not just the outward appearance but the inner reality, saw it first. There was no fruit, not a single fig, not a small budding promise of a future harvest. There was only the green, the leaves, the beautiful empty facade. The disciples, in their earnest hope, did not see it at first, their minds so fixed on the promise of the leaves that they were blind to the barrenness of the branches. But as they looked, the truth began to settle on them like a cold dust. Their eager expressions turned to confusion, then to a quiet disappointment. The crack was not in the tree itself, but in the expectation it had created, the dissonance between its perfect outward form and its inner emptiness. The leaves were a lie, a beautiful deception that hid the fact that the tree was a fraud. It was a tree that had been given every opportunity to bear fruit, to fulfill its purpose, and it had chosen instead to simply appear to be alive. The crack was the silent, devastating truth that a life of beautiful leaves without the fruit of a generous heart is an empty, meaningless thing. The disciples' quiet disappointment was a mirror of my own profound sadness. The crisis arrived with a single devastating sentence, spoken not in anger, but in sorrow. My disciples, now standing before the barren tree, were looking at me, their faces a mixture of confusion and disappointment. They saw a great mystery. The tree was perfect in every way, and yet it had failed to live up to its promise. They waited for an explanation, for a gentle word of comfort or a riddle to solve. Instead, I spoke a truth that was so powerful it shook the very ground. I looked at the tree not with anger, but with a deep, profound sadness, and I said, "May no one ever eat fruit from you again." The words were a breaking point, a moment of profound spiritual consequence made manifest in the physical world. The disciples were stunned into silence. This was not a soft word of teaching, but a sharp and final judgment. The tree, in its beautiful deception, had stood as a living lie, a testament to the danger of a life of appearance over substance. It had been given everything it needed to bear fruit, and it had chosen to produce nothing but leaves. My words were a final, unyielding truth, a declaration that a life that promises much but delivers nothing is a life that is withering away. The breaking point was not a punishment, but a divine declaration of a truth that was already in motion. The tree had already chosen to be barren, and I had simply given voice to its choice. The immediate consequence of my words was a rapid, visible transformation. The next morning, as we passed by the same spot, The disciples stopped and stared in awe and fear. The tree, which had been so lush and full of life just a day before, was now a dry, withered husk. Its broad, green leaves were now brown and brittle, a dusty mockery of the life they had once represented. The branches, which had been so full and welcoming, were now shriveled and gnarled, a collection of broken and lifeless wood. The very roots of the tree had withered away, a final, unyielding testament to the fact that its life had been in its leaves and not in its purpose. The shift was dramatic and immediate. It was not a slow decay, but a sudden, startling revelation. The life that had so beautifully masked its emptiness was now gone, and all that remained was the hollow shell of a tree that had refused to fulfill its purpose. The disciples looked at the tree, and their awe turned to a deep and quiet understanding. They saw that the tree was not a victim, but a consequence. It had made its choice, and it had been given what it had chosen: a life of emptiness, a life without fruit, a life that had finally withered away into nothingness. The tree in its death was now speaking a truth it had refused to speak in its life. The purpose of the tree in its death became far greater than any harvest it could have ever produced in its life. Its purpose was to be a permanent, unyielding lesson, a sermon preached not in words but in its withered branches. It stood as a warning to all who would listen, a symbol of the profound danger of living a life of appearance. It taught that it is not enough to simply be alive. It is not enough to simply look the part. It is not enough to be filled with leaves, with the beautiful outward signs of a spiritual life. What truly matters is the fruit, the acts of love, the moments of compassion, the words of kindness, the willingness to share what you have with others. The tree was a declaration that a life that promises much but gives nothing is a life that is in a state of decay, a life that is withering away from the inside out. Its purpose was to be a living, breathing testament to the fact that God seeks not just a beautiful form, but a fruitful heart. Its purpose was to be a constant, sober reminder to my disciples and to all who would follow them that their lives were meant to be a blessing, a harvest of love and compassion for a world that was hungry for a harvest. The tree was a parable in itself, a living, breathing, and finally, a dying testament to the truth that a life without purpose is a life without meaning. The impact of the tree's death was not lost on my disciples. It was a lesson they would never forget, a truth that would be etched into their hearts and their ministry forever. The tree in its barrenness had become a living monument to the power of a life lived with purpose. They would never again be able to look at a beautiful leafy tree without asking the question, "Where is the fruit?" They would never again be able to see a life of outward piety without asking, "Where is the love?" The lesson was a simple one, but it was one that would change the world. It was a lesson that would guide them in their ministry, in their service, and in their own spiritual lives. The tree had died, but its lesson had taken root in the hearts of my disciples, and it would grow into a harvest of love and compassion that would feed the world for all eternity. It was a lesson that would be a source of strength in their darkest moments, a reminder that their lives, in their own unique way, were meant to be a blessing. The tree had given its life, and in its death it had given them a profound and unshakable truth that would shape their destiny forever. My disciples were a lot like that fig tree. They were a collection of men from all walks of life, fishermen, tax collectors, zealous patriots, but they were all united in their purpose. They had left their homes, their families, and their livelihoods to follow me, and they were full of life and promise. They were my students, my friends, and my chosen ones. They were eager to learn, and they were always full of questions. Their lives on the outside were a lot like the fig trees. They were filled with the beautiful leaves of enthusiasm, a visible sign of their devotion. They had all the right things in their lives. They had left everything to follow me. They were learning my teachings. They were performing miracles in my name. They were a living, breathing testament to the power of a life lived in purpose. Their lives seemed to promise a bounty of fruit, a great harvest of souls that would one day fill the kingdom. On the outside, they were perfect. They looked the part. They were ready to go out and change the world. The first crack in their perfect facade was not a sudden act of betrayal, but a slow, subtle decay of their spiritual lives. I saw it every day, in the way they argued about who was the greatest among them, in the way they sought positions of power, in the way they spoke of the kingdom as a political victory rather than a spiritual one. Their hearts were full of the leaves of ambition and pride, but they were barren of the fruit of true humility and unconditional love. They were like the fig tree, so full of leaves that they had no room for fruit. They were so focused on the outward appearances of discipleship that they had forgotten the most important part of the journey, the inner work of the heart. The crack was in their silent competition, in their hushed whispers about who would sit at my right hand and my left. The crack was in the way they treated others, in the way they sought honor for themselves rather than for others. It was a subtle, almost imperceptible flaw, but it was there, and it was the sign of a life that was in danger of withering away. The breaking point came when I spoke to them about the fig tree. They had been so stunned by the withering of the tree, so full of awe and fear, that they were waiting for me to explain the miracle, but I did not. Instead, I turned the mirror on them. I told them that the tree was not a random act of judgment, but a living parable for their own lives. I told them that they were so full of leaves, so full of the outward appearances of discipleship, that they had no room for fruit. The breaking point was the moment they understood that the story of the fig tree was not about a tree but about them. They saw their own pride, their own ambition, their own lack of love, and they saw themselves as the barren tree, a life that was promising much but delivering nothing. It was a moment of profound conviction, a moment when the beautiful facade of their discipleship was stripped away, and they were left with the reality of their own spiritual emptiness. It was a moment of painful, agonizing honesty, a moment when they finally saw themselves not as they wanted to be, but as they truly were. The realization was a profound shift in their hearts. They began to see their lives not as a journey toward personal gain, but as a journey toward a humble, generous heart. They began to see that the true purpose of their lives was not in what they could get, but in what they could give. The pride that had been so deeply ingrained in their hearts began to wither away, and in its place a new kind of love began to take root. They began to see their fellow disciples not as rivals but as brothers. They began to see the world not as a place to be conquered, but as a field to be harvested, a place where they could share the fruit of their lives with others. The shift was not an overnight miracle, but a slow, deliberate transformation of the heart. It was a journey from a life of leaves to a life of fruit, a journey from a life of self to a life of service. It was a journey of letting go of the old and embracing the new, a journey of dying to themselves so that they could live for others. Their new purpose was clear and unwavering, to be bearers of fruit. They would no longer seek honor for themselves but for me. They would no longer seek positions of power but of service. They would no longer seek to build a name for themselves, but to build a kingdom for me. Their lives, which had once been so focused on the outward appearances of discipleship, were now focused on the inner work of the heart. They understood that the greatest miracle was not in what they could do, but in who they could be. They were a living testament to the truth that a life of true purpose is found not in what you get, but in what you give. They were a living, breathing testament to the truth that a life of true purpose is found not in what you get, but in what you give. They were a living, breathing testament to the truth that a life of true purpose is found not in what you get, but in what you give. And so, the story concluded with a final, unyielding truth. My disciples, who had once been so full of leaves and so barren of fruit, were now transformed. They had learned the lesson of the fig tree, and they had chosen to live a different life, a life of abundance, a life of purpose, a life that was truly worthy of the kingdom. The fig tree had died, but its lesson had given them life. And for all eternity, they would be a testament to the truth that a life without fruit is a life that is withering away. Just as I once walked with my disciples and saw a fig tree full of leaves but empty of fruit, I see you here, full of potential. You have gathered a beautiful community, each of you drawn by a deep hunger for truth and meaning. Yet it is not enough to simply be present, to see the lessons I offer as mere information. The true harvest comes not from the leaves of passive listening, but from the fruit of active engagement. What good is a tree that looks alive but feeds no one? I see in you a great promise, just as I saw in my disciples. But remember, they too had their struggles, their moments of competition and pride. The story of the withered tree was not a punishment for its barrenness, but a powerful lesson for them about their own hearts. It was a mirror held up to their lives. I ask you to look at your own lives in the same way. Are you simply full of outward appearances, or are you bearing the fruit of a transformed life? This channel is a place for you to be fed, but it is also a place for you to feed others. The deepest insights, the most profound transformations often happen in community. When you simply watch and pass by, you are like that tree, holding on to a great potential that never gets shared. Do not let your wisdom, your reflections, and your growth wither away in silence. Let your comments be a testimony, a seed planted in the soil of this community. As the story of the fig tree became a powerful, permanent lesson, so too can your engagement become a testament to others. Your presence here is a gift, but your participation is a blessing. When you press the like button, you are not just acknowledging a video, but affirming a truth. When you subscribe, you are not just joining a list, but committing to a journey of growth and purpose. The world is hungry for a harvest, and you, my friends, are the ones who can provide it. Just as my disciples went out and shared the fruit of their transformed lives, I ask you to do the same. This channel is just one branch. Your lives are the entire tree. Do not let the lesson end here. Be a source of life, a well of living water for a thirsty world. Let your actions here be the beginning of a life of abundance. TRET.